Okay, here we are. Anant, we're back for another episode of our favorite podcast.
Awesome. And this time you are part of IBM. I think
Yes.
last time when you did it, you were almost there, but not fully there. So again, an extreme warm welcome to all of you. It it's it's been a pleasure working with you, and hopefully we can continue it for quite some time, including today. Let's go have some fun.
Awesome. Yes, yes. Anant was referring to the fact that DataStax is now officially part of IBM, and super excited about that. Great stuff for all the developers and enterprises that are using us for, among other things, for RAG, which is going to be one of the topics that we get into in depth today, unstructured data, and how people are using it to build retrieval. But first of all, let's talk about some of the recent news, recent thoughts. And you had some things you wanted to kick off with.
Yes, yes. I mean, obviously, we are not very consistent, but we should be with is
Yeah.
what caught our attention, and we should not have recency bias. But if you recall, last time we were talking about what caught your attention from Arvind's keynote at Think, and you had mentioned a lot about agents and everything else, and then I had kind of chimed in and said, look, all that is good and expected, but what was really surprising was quantum and how bullish Arvind was and IBM was with respect to quantum being not around the corner, which always happens, but really quite imminent. And in the background, I always had this view that Jensen from NVIDIA has been kind of somewhat of a naysayer, saying quantum is not coming. And what caught my attention in the last 15 days or so is that he actually changed his tune and said that he actually believes that the sets of advances that are happening in quantum are are very very positive, and he agrees with IBM and others that we are turning the corner. So that was to me something where we had quantum had won over a really hard skeptic, and I think the sets of dominoes are falling. But of course, today we are going to talk about more mundane AI stuff. But that's how I wanted to connect the dots with the previous podcast that we had.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, well, really, I mean, that's been the story, I think, of all of the technologies over the last few years. It just seems like we've maybe fallen into a little bit I think because a lot of these technologies were such a long time coming that people started to bake a level of skepticism in terms of what they were doing, and just perennially saying that's 10 years out, and this has been super exciting, over the last few years, where we just see that the lot of things, and which many of us feel quantum, and obviously even now Jensen to recently, things that we've been saying are 10 years out, or who knows whenever, and suddenly it's here now, and so
Yeah.
that'll be
The-
pretty exciting.
This is in contrast with now the opposite worldview, where people are saying it's happening like in 1 year, all jobs are going to get eliminated. Or I was reading about this company called Mechanize, and which is using reinforcement learning to start to kind of simulate enough environments and then train models around it. And of course, there's 2027. So there is an opposite end, which is not only is change happening, it's imminent. I think that we tend to go between it'll take too long and it'll take too short, and the truth is always somewhere in between.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think and hopefully that's one of the things that from what we're trying to do in this series is to weave a path. Obviously, our point of view is very technology forward. We are excited about these topics, this technology. We do think that it is pragmatic to be planning to put it into production. It's not about going and saying that everybody's going to be vibe coding everything next week, but But that said, when we look over an 18-month time horizon, a 3-year time horizon, these things are having a material impact. And so hopefully the people that at least are following us on this aren't falling into one of those two camps. I figure they're either off on Twitter following whoever levels or whatever vibe coding hero that's out there, or they're curmudgeonly reading Gary Marcus and saying this stuff's never going to work ever. You know,
Yeah, exactly.
we'll navigate a path between those two.
Awesome, man.
Yeah. Cool. So one of the things that we are going to touch on today is really some of the issues around pulling data in, and how that leads to dealing with accuracy challenges, and really I think, at least for the conversations that I'm having with folks, is really at the intersection of where most companies that are trying to put this stuff into production are grappling with. It's not about the AGI question or what have you. It really just is the fact that businesses have a significant amount of data and knowledge that, if they can unlock in a very reliable and repeatable way, is going to be the path to having a huge amount of business impact. So that's one of the topics that or our primary topic for today.
Awesome. Let's go. Let's dive straight in.
Great.
Rag.
So
Yeah. Rag,
so I
rag,
mean,
rag, rag. Okay.
well, rag is probably is the starting point, and I think it's useful to recap a little bit some of the things that happened over the last couple of years on this, right? And obviously, we saw the introduction of LLMs and chat-based interfaces, and really the question that a lot of people looked at was to say, how do we take that and how do we put that to work with our specific information, domain-specific information, business-specific information. And there were a couple of answers around that very early on. People talked a lot about, fine tuning, particularly in the 2023 timeframe, and at the same time, RAG and the RAG research paper was published that started talking about this idea that the model had what we call parametric memory, which is the what's been encoded in the model through training, but that at generation time, that equally important, or perhaps even more so important, is this non-parametric memory, the knowledge that's not encoded in the model, but comes from other systems. Obviously, this is something that's near and dear to my heart, with the work we did at DataStax, because probably one of the most important sources of non-parametric memory was and is what's encoded within databases and data systems, and that kicked off a whole set of things. Vector databases, being a big representation of it, but there's a lot more to it than that.
I know. That's extremely well put. I had not heard of that kind of characterization between what exists in models and what exists in databases, and I'll definitely go in and read up. But I actually had, when I started to kind of read and understand this, there are two things that kind of played in my mind, Ed. The first one really was the fact that we have seen this movie a bit before, obviously, in the sense that for those of us who were building enterprise search long time back, knew that enterprise search is a very different problem than the web search, because the kind of connectivity between documents and others was not that strong within enterprise search, whereas it was this, and the ability to use PageRank was not that strong in enterprise search. And therefore, what that led us to was the fact that individual document characteristics, which at that time was TF-IDF, were not sufficient to really understand relevance. but you have to kind of find something slightly more than that. And then when I look at what's happening in kind of the RAG world, we are talking about embeddings, but then people are realizing that embeddings by themselves are individual document characteristics or sub-document characteristics, and then we've got to do certain things like graph and other graph RAG and others to kind of connect the dots. So I said, okay, this kind of looks somewhat parallel. But then the second thing that, given my kind of database geekiness, was the fact that there is a perpetual debate, Ed, which is does one size fit all, okay, or fit for purpose, right? And it's not exactly clear which way the world goes, but there's clearly a tension in the market which says that if you have to get that representational or non-representational stuff from database and other things, that do you build specialized stores for it, or whether standard stores where the stuff exists can actually build specialized indexes around that stuff, right? So I could see the movie play out in kind of both those dimensions, but obviously in a very, very different context now, which is to kind of feed prompts into generative AI.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think and I think that's been part of the challenge has been this technology has caused a bunch of different camps that had largely sort of broken off in different directions to be all pulled to the table. Mm-hmm. And you had your model folks who had one point of view, and we can talk about that in a bit in terms of really this idea that that the model somehow ends up being your source of truth, which yes. I think we
source of truth and hallucination.
Yes, well, I mean, I get why the model folks come from that point of view, but it was never realistically grounded in the realities of data as it exists in the real world. Mm-hmm. But as you were pointing out, all that being aside, the fact that you had your search problem, which is deeply rooted in, or at the very least has a fairly large dependency on the nature of dealing with unstructured data and a lot of relevancy issues around that. With the fact that there's a lot of structured data that people expect to be part of the search problem, and this has been an ongoing issue for many, many years, and people have had to take these approaches and typically wed it with some form of data architecture on top of it, because you've got your systems of record, you've got your various forms of secondary indexes that can span these. You've got your systems for going and requesting data out of live systems of record where necessary. You've got your intermediary stages, your various data warehouse, data lake approaches. Like the world of making data, a lot of things have to happen behind the scenes for you to be able to go and do that lookup yes. that yes. You take for granted, and that was already a for lack of a better word, it was already a mess prior to saying let's throw AI on top of it.
Yes, yes,
right?
Yes.
And so then the questions became, can you take a purely model-centric approach? Should we be going and taking all of this data and somehow training it into a model? Should every business be going and fine-tuning or creating their own models around their data? A lot of these ideas were things that I would regularly, and I know you as well, but as we would go and meet with various enterprises that were navigating this, these were the points of view that were very prevalent, and I think that essentially you needed a data architecture that would allow you to to figure out where the sources of truth were, where the systems of record, but to leverage those in an appropriate way within, what some of the analysts would use the term, system of engagement or system of interaction, which is essentially where the model lives, or at least within most of these knowledge-based type of apps, where it lives. And so I think what we're seeing now is the emergence of an architecture that supports, sort of agentic inquiry, if that makes sense.
Now, from a pure database person perspective, I know why all of that is needed in order to feed the right context into the models, and we agree that fine-tuning is not necessarily the answer in most cases for various reasons. You and I have talked about the fact that fine-tuning is not easy to do anyway. You can't really fine-tune your way out of frontier models because the weights are not available to you. And also you can't fine-tune your way out of more recent data and everything. And so fine-tuning has its.
Well, definitely helps for orienting your model, particularly around specific domain concepts.
Yes.
And yes.
Yes. But it has its limits, and therefore that's why RAG was born, and that's why RAG kind of plays an extremely important role out there. But we know that the biggest variance, no, we don't know, but I'm just asserting here, the biggest variance in how LLMs respond to you is the kind of careful prompting, right? And we have seen so much of, this Claude's prompt was leaked, or this was leaked, and everything else. And therefore that looks like somewhat of more of, from a pure kind of scientific perspective, that looks more like an art than science, because you're saying, either you're saying expletive words, or you're saying don't blackmail me, or you're saying please, 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 or whatever. It just sounds very non-scientific to me. And then when we add RAG to it, now we have taken something that is slightly kind of artish as opposed to science-ish, and now we have kind of added yet another component to it, which is somewhat, look, have I retrieved the right things, and what was it, right? So just from a pure science perspective, it seems a bit of a bolt-on to me, okay? As opposed to kind of principled, everything is captured in the weights and it is what it is and everything else like that. So that's why I've just, the scientist in me is not, I know there are lots of hard problems to be solved in RAG and everything else, but the scientist in me still finds it a bit unscientific, if I may say so.
Yeah, I mean, I recall, Wolfram had written something a year or two ago to that effect.
Oh, yeah, Wolfram had, yes, I remember.
Yeah.
This big tome on this one that I hadn't, I don't recall fully now.
Yeah, no, it was good. It was actually, but anyway, yes. Thankfully, I'm not a scientist. I am an engineer, which means I just hit it with a hammer until it works.
Okay, now you made it sound like a pejorative thing for me. Okay, thankfully, I'm not a scientist.
But yeah, there is. And honestly, I think that's a valid point, and it is worth calling out, because at least when I talk to a lot of folks, I they struggle with it, and I go and say, no, look, don't fall for the marketing hype. At the end of the day, the one part that is true is there's a lot of trial and error, and what trial and error means is, it is more than art. There are certain aspects of it that are more art than science. You will take a look at your construction of your prompts. You will take a look at your, for example, your document ingestion. One of the areas that ends up being, an area where a lot of people spend a lot of time and effort. Somebody made this point a few weeks ago, which was, effectively to the point you're making, which was that they were like, that they've been doing databases for many, many years, and, what does this accuracy thing mean? It's like, you're either, you either retrieved the result or you didn't, right? And so for a lot of database folks, this accuracy piece and how to measure accuracy and what goes into that ends up being a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. No, exactly,
And
exactly. No,
and
no, of
so
course.
yeah.
I know who you're talking about. We won't name them. Hey, so a few other things. As you can see, I want to kind of take a bit of a point, slightly different than yours.
Yep.
Uh, you are you love RAG for what it can do. I like RAG, but don't love RAG for the reason that I just mentioned. But I'm going to kind of ask you a series of questions about where the world is going forward in the future. So one is, everybody says that RAG will, not everybody, sorry, the skeptics say that RAG is irrelevant once the context windows become really, really large. What's your view there, Ed?
So generally, the people who say that sort of thing are people who are trying to sell you a model. I I think that large context windows are a wonderful thing for building RAG applications. Look, there's doesn't matter how big the context window gets, we have plenty of data to fill it with. And you see this in plenty of different domains. Look, the idea that I'm just going to deal with a single document and I'm going to throw that into the context window and that's how I'm going to solve the problem. That's great from a summarization problem, but nothing precludes nothing like a current state of the art RAG system presupposes that. Like 2 years ago, when the context windows were much smaller, what it meant was just that we spend more time in chunking. And now that we've got a larger context window, then that's great. There's still a lot of work that goes into structuring that context. We know that the more, at the moment, and I do think this will get solved out over time, but we also know that the more that you put various unrelated or semi-related, context or excuse me, concepts or chunks of content into a single context window, that your results start to get very muddy, and generally, this goes back to the art rather than science, which is that all things being equal, if I am sitting in front of somebody who's working on a RAG project and they're saying I'm having a really hard time, one of the things I will look at is, what are you feeding into the context window? Are you feeding more than is necessary? And 9 out of 10 times, you start looking at these, where their relevancy scores and so on are dropping, and what you find is that they're flooding the context with too many unrelated sets of data.
No,
And so the context windows getting larger doesn't, if anything, it makes building these systems easier. It gives us more paths to accuracy. But I think what happened is this. Look, I think these statements, and again, I'm not trying to beat up on model people, but look, honestly, most people who got into the business of building models did so because they didn't want to actually be going and dealing with the heterogeneous enterprise data state. They didn't want to go and be building knowledge bases that cross that allowed you to go and tag your inventory system and deal with your product catalog. So a lot of these statements were where you go and say, oh, context windows erase this or whatever. Typically, again, it's somebody who has something to sell. They haven't sort of lived with sort of the real world of, how do I take a whole bunch of sets of structured and unstructured data and turn them into a system that actually allows me to do something. And when you zoom out and you start dealing with those things in the real world, you're like, oh, context window getting bigger. That's awesome. That's great. That means that maybe I don't have to be as fine grained in my chunking. Maybe I can do more interest, but it's a tool in the toolbox is the long and short of it.
Okay. No, that's
Yeah.
an awesome point. Obviously, as you can see, I've argued a point slightly different than yours, but I think the points that you're making are absolutely valid. So let me kind of ask you a couple of other kind of somewhat provocative questions. But first, I want to make an
Why
observation.
do I get all the provocative questions?
No, you can ask me also, Anand, how come you're working in such a wonderfully beautiful place? Look at the background at the back, which is not fake. That's real, right?
That actually does look really good. I should go down there more often.
Yeah,
That
exactly. It's the
hillside is.
problem is in California, Bay Area, and in summer is brown. So that's the way it is. Hey, you made a wonderful point, which is that if remember we had talked about windsurf and its acquisition,
Yeah.
and clearly my Git repo, my code, okay, is something that is being seen by the models for the first time within the context of cursor or anything else, and that is just context, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And ragifying that context so that if I have a huge repo, then maybe you can feed that entire repo, but really having the model to focus on the right things for the right task really makes sense. So that's a classic example of models are what the models are, and each of these guys have their own models, and yet ragification in some form is extremely relevant for enabling developer
Well,
quality.
that one is a good one because it segues into sort of the question of what's RAG and what isn't. Now, again, there's a lot of vendorification of the space, and that's like and not just that. Like everybody wants to either, whether it's from the academic side, everybody wants to go and promote their research paper as the new thing, and then from a vendor standpoint, all vendors, and of course, we're vendors too, are trying to create differentiation. So this question is this RAG and it's not RAG? Oh, we don't do RAG, right? Ultimately, like, going back to the basics, if it isn't parametric memory, meaning it's not in the model, it's just RAG with extra steps. And by way of example on that, yes, the points you made about cursor and windsurf and what we see in a lot of these great coding tools, the magic comes from the fact that they are figuring out how to retrieve and curate the context with the appropriate source code artifacts that are part of your software project, and you can go and look and say, oh, that's not RAG, and it's like we can play semantic stuff, but essentially they are doing retrieval to augment the generation. Excuse me, and essentially a lot of work goes into that, and specifically the types of, and this is where you go and start to see some of the techniques that people are using to to make RAG more accurate, and a lot of the work that gets done through things like static code analysis or figuring out which files, right? Context windows may be really huge, but a large, source code project, you're not going to want to dump your entire source code into a single context window. It's going to be a mess, and so a lot of work gets done into figuring out which file. How they do that retrieval varies quite a bit,
Yep.
but packing that context with the right things, maybe it includes a symbol table or some form of DAG representation of the code or whatever. Like all of those are the secret sauce that these various tools use. In the document world, a lot of that's already happening. Things like GraphRag that people talk about are a form of that. That's your mechanisms of doing entity extraction and so on for being able to go and do some form of lookup that isn't just straight off the documents, that is related to what the entity relationships are with individual documents and even between documents. So again, that's where this next generation of stuff, or that's where a lot of the focus is.
No, I
Sorry.
think that's an awesome point. As we were doing our own kind of coding and tooling, something around Watson Code Assistant, we actually realized that traditional document chunking and mechanisms don't exactly work. And you have to understand that code has more structure and a different structure, and being able to analyze it and and ragify it appropriately, et cetera, makes a huge difference. So you're absolutely right that depending on what the corpus is, RAG doesn't become irrelevant, but just how you kind of fetch the right context in varies on what the corpus is. Okay, awesome point. Hey, one more provocative question, and that's the last one, and then you can ask me some other ones. But this industry seems to be an industry that seems to go from waves of hype to the next thing. So for example, in 23, it was all about models, and OpenAI was the rage. And then there was a debate between OpenAI and smaller models, for example, IBM coming up with that latter perspective. In 2024, it was all about RAG and how do you kind of build the RAG pipelines and everything else. In 2025, it's all about agents.
Yeah.
Okay? And everything else. So at some level, you say, okay, is the industry jumping from one important thing to the next? Or is it the case that each of these next waves doesn't actually do away with the important thing, but it kind of affects? So for example, if you believe in this, if you think this is true, how does the world of agents and RAG change? Agents can use RAG, but how you RAG, does it change in this agentic world, etc.? What's your view out there with kind of this current wave, which is no longer about RAG, but it's agent? How do these two worlds kind of come together in your view?
Yeah. So, just to zoom out a little bit, since again, our title of this series is Context Window, and hopefully we provide
Yes.
people with a little bit of,
Yep.
a little bit of context on that. So I view it as there is a, there's a walk, a not so random walk, but a walk through the problem space, and then at the same time in parallel, there's sort of a walk through the value space. And a lot of the buzz and the hype is where people are trying to attribute value. They're either trying to capture a corner or promote the value of what they're doing, and so that ends up where you get these cycles. But for me, and I know you and I have had this conversation many times, that at least from a practitioner, from an implementation view, that's why I said it's a not so random walk, because I actually think that these things all build on each other. I think that we look at where agents are, right now, and a lot of the pieces of agents either end up being related to sort of the reasoning, the iteration, the reflection, the react, and so on. The second pieces tend to be around, the tool calling and the pieces around that. A lot of what, everyone is excited with just justifiable reason. You and I have spent a lot of time, even in our previous two podcasts, talking about MCP. And in many ways, MCP is an evolution of what we learned in building these RAG systems, where we said, okay, RAG is about trying to focus on a specific type of unstructured data that we're pulling into the retrieval stage in a very tightly coupled way, because these RAG systems were just very tightly coupled. The question is, can we abstract that? Can we, rather than just saying, let's hard code that the system should always go to some form of database, can we abstract that out into a tool model so that now I can go to APIs, I can go to data stores, I can go to other aspects of my computer through computer tool use and so on. And so that's one piece of it. But I think the second piece of it that ends up being really important is this fact that reasoning in the loop means that the retrieval is in many ways both accurate, but also can actually explode and fan out as the model doesn't just go and take your first order inquiry, but actually goes and reflects on what you asked, reflects on the information that it retrieved, and uses that for some form of iterative or even fan out retrievals to then go and assemble the context that it needs and evaluates and so on. So it has changed the landscape is the long and short of that. So agentic, I think, is what you're getting at with that question. To some degree, yes, it's an evolution, but in many ways literally explodes out the problem.
More money for Jensen then.
Well, what I will say is it definitely, it was a very interesting thing when you go back to his keynote where he talked about, tokens, right? And,
We discussed that last time.
we did, but I honestly, it's just I will keep making this observation because I always try to look and say, okay, what part, you and I have been doing this for many years, and as you pointed out with enterprise search and all, what's the one thing that's changed? And it is that token counter. I mean, I can tell a practitioner from somebody who's just read a whole bunch of Medium posts, really, it gets into that. It gets into the question of like how much are they worried about the tokens, right?
Exactly. Okay. Awesome. Hey, one thing that we haven't touched today, but I hope that we can touch next time, and I know you also want to talk about A2A and others, but my favorite topic is really on somewhat of non-determinism and hallucinations. How do we turn what is a feature of this whole world? Hallucination, after all, is a feature. Nothing works in Gen AI without hallucination. Into something that's not a liability, and I worry about that a lot, because in the end, if you remember the quote I had done last time that I think also made it into one of the reels, was that if you can't depend on it, it's entertainment. Now clearly I was making a big point, but then in this kind of RAG world, you're stringing together a set of kind of approximations. What you retrieve is approximate, how you feed into the prompt in whatever order is approximate, what the Gen AI does approximate, and then you kind of generate that into agents, and agents are right. So you're just kind of multiplying the approximations together, and it makes me a bit nervous that all the excitement that we think about it has to meet this kind of reality of, does it actually work in some environments, or maybe it is the case that the world will evolve to adjust to these kind of variances. I don't know, but I'd like to have that discussion with you and maybe get some expert along. But that to me is kind of a logical thing of going from very hard determinism databases to this thing, which is I'm going to do whatever I can do, and trust me, it's great.
Well, I mean, I think that's I think that is the essence of the challenge. I mean, I think that the question becomes, should we be looking at these as fundamentally a deterministic system that there is some streamlined, simple architecture for, or do we expect that it is going to be some form of non-deterministic, in which case you start to look at various corrective answers, right? And you have got things like CRAG, right? Corrective RAG. You see a lot of work done around re-ranking models for getting accuracy of results. You see a lot of things that go and say that like it or not, you are ultimately building an architecture, and the architecture is going to have some form of self-correction in it, and I tend to subscribe to that point of view, but it's more from a pragmatic approach, which is to say that you can build these systems and you can get results. But I also think part of the balancing act is that there's going to be also just some form of understanding as to how to operate with these systems. And so I think that there's a little bit of the meeting in the middle. And the examples I give on that, I'm old enough to have seen previous waves of technology. When you had things on the web, and people were like, "Oh my God, what if I publish something on my website that isn't accurate?" So people came in and said, "Well, I need very complex approval chains. Nothing can go on my website until everybody has gone and approved it," and that was what caused the content management industry to show up. There was a point of view from a mobile standpoint, which was to say that well, connectivity is unreliable, and so what we need to do is we need to base everything on store and forward systems, and of course, IBM in the '90s, right? With that approach and a lot of things. In the 2000s, and now you go and say, okay, look, it's just the nature of a mobile app for the
I got it.
2 to 5 minutes I'm offline. I don't have connectivity. Well, I think you're going to. What I'm getting at is I think that there's some of it is just sort of an acceptance right now. People who deal with these systems, a lot of people come at it from a very sort of 100% or it's trash point of view,
That's a good point.
and I think that's going to relax. Now, on the other hand, what I do think is a really interesting follow-on that I think we should do is get into the different approaches, and there's a lot of great stuff that's happening in the research domain. We should do some follow-up on doing a deep dive into some of the different approaches. But generally, what I tend to see is that from my from my basic surveying of these things tends to be going and saying, okay, any one model inference is going to potentially introduce something that is inaccurate in the way that it's going to be some form of corrective action that catches that. And some people don't like it because they go and say, oh, but the guardrail or the corrective evaluator or whatever is going to not catch it, and to which the answer will be, yeah, we're never going to get to 100%. We're going to decrease.
No, but it'll be a good discussion to have.
Yeah.
Hey, so Ed, we are kind of out of time, or more importantly, maybe out of patience for.
I can't believe we filled the time. When we started this, we said we're not going to have enough to talk about.
Yeah. But I know. That's never a danger. Hey, I've got a bit of a just talking about bad internet. It looks like there's a problem here. Okay, listen, we want to end on kind of call to action. So if I can begin, and then hopefully Ed, you can add to it. So I think that what I would say, based on kind of listening to you, thinking about it, and everything else, is that even though agents occupy all your attention, the fact of the matter is that a good data architecture and a good RAG pipeline that feeds stuff into the agents still remains as fundamentally important as before.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So please don't go chase the next shiny object called agents, and forget about the fact that in the end it is data that feeds into the AI system. So please go invest correctly. Now you may want to MCPIs your RAG pipelines and everything else, so which is just kind of how do you interface it, but kind of good data infrastructure is really important. So even though they are not the flavor of the day, they're still as important, perhaps more important than they were yesterday.
Yeah, I know we went completely off script on this. We didn't talk about ingestion at all. We didn't talk about mixing your unstructured and structured results. We didn't talk about text to SQL. We didn't talk about all of our favorite topics just because there's so much to talk about on this. But yes, you do need building the right ingestion pipeline becomes very important. Building the right query patterns. Again, just some of the things that we recap very quickly on that maybe we'll do a follow up on a subsequent one on. Not every a lot of people go and say, oh, I don't want to use a vector database. That's fine. You can build a perfectly good RAG system directly against relational data, and many people do. RAG does not equal vector retrieval, and a lot of people are dealing with extremely heterogeneous data sets where they want to be able to pull these things in. Agentic, from an architecture standpoint, might simplify that, but the basic there a lot goes into query optimization, a lot goes into your data architecture to enable these types of things, particularly when you start looking. We touched briefly on this. One of the areas where understanding that an agentic system is one of your one of your primary clients for your data architecture becomes a really big deal because they can generate an awful lot of queries in a very short amount of time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So now, instead of just Jensen counting money, people who are building data infrastructure also get a lot more queries and all that stuff. That makes me really, really happy. Okay. Hey, awesome as always, Ed. It was good. We tried this. We've tried 3 different environments. First time you were in DataStax Studio.
Yes.
Second time we were at Think. Third time we are remote. Okay. I don't know what a fourth one would be, but
We'll keep people guessing.
Yeah. I'm sure that Michelle and Milan will figure something out. But as always, absolutely awesome interacting with you, and hopefully the audience will wait for the next one from us. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, everyone.